federal judge today demanded that the Trump Justice Department explain a Trump tweet. And the Trump Justice Department admitted that they have no idea what the Trump tweet means. Federal Judge George Hazel conducted an emergency telephone conference with the Justice Department and some of the lawyers representing plaintiffs in the census case that was just decided by the United States Supreme Court last week, preventing the census from containing a question about citizenship. And as we reported here last night, the Trump administration surrendered to the Supreme Court yesterday. They formally surrendered and began printing the census without a citizenship question as ordered by the United States Supreme Court. The Commerce Secretary announced that the census was being printed without the citizenship question. And then this morning, the president tweeted, the news reports about the Department of Commerce dropping its quest to put the citizenship question on the census is incorrect, or to state it differently, fake. That set federal judge George Hazel into action, rounding up lawyers in the case by phone to find out what was going on. In a transcript of the conference call today, the judge said, this morning, I saw a tweet that got my attention. I don't know how many federal judges have Twitter accounts, but I happen to be one of them, and I follow the president. And so I saw a tweet that directly contradicted the position that Mr. Gardner had shared with me yesterday. Joshua Gardner is one of the Justice Department lawyers in the case. The judge asked Attorney Gardner a simple question. Is the government going to continue efforts to place a citizenship question on the 2020 census? And Attorney Gardner said, the tweet this morning was the first I had heard of the president's position on this issue, just like the plaintiffs and Your Honor. I do not have a deeper understanding of what that means at this juncture other than what the president has tweeted. No one on that call knew what Donald Trump's tweet meant, including Donald Trump's Justice Department attorneys. And Attorney Gardner did confirm that the census is in the process of being printed without the citizenship question. Another Justice Department lawyer told the judge, we at the Department of Justice have been instructed to examine whether there is a path forward consistent with the Supreme Court decision that would allow us to include the citizenship question on the census. We're examining that, looking at near-term options to see whether that's viable and possible. The judge ordered the government lawyers to tell him by 2 p.m. Friday if the government is going to continue fighting the case. The government lawyers asked for a delay until Monday because of the 4th of July holiday, to which the judge, as I just said, simply said no. The judge then told the government lawyers, if you were Facebook and an attorney for Facebook told me one thing, and then I read a press release from Mark Zuckerberg telling me something else, I would be demanding that Mark Zuckerberg appear in court with you the next time, because I would be saying, I don't think you speak for your client anymore. Leading off our discussion tonight, Neera Tanden, the president of the Center for American Progress, and Eugene Robinson, associate editor and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post. He's an MSNBC political analyst. And Gene, this was a remarkable, very quick telephone conference today where the president tweets something, and we bring America's best legal minds to study it, and none of them can figure out what he meant.
Right, and they work for the president. So the president is their client in this, and they have no idea. They clearly had no idea this was coming. They thought the issue was settled. The president tweeted that it wasn't settled, and so they have to now, I guess, try to find a way to unsettle it again, and to try to come up with some rationale, which, the judge was clearly not amused. And they must be scratching their heads and saying, okay, what are we going to come up with that's not going to get us either laughed out of court or yelled out of court or whatever, and we better come up with it by 2 p.m. on Friday, or this judge might, who knows what this judge might do if we don't. So it was an extraordinary moment in our extraordinary moment in the life of this country.
Yeah, and they would, Neera, they would have to begin to suborn perjury from the Commerce Secretary to get him to change his under oath testimony about why he wanted a citizenship question. They want to try to figure out a way to give the Supreme Court a different reason why they wanted one. But as you listen to or read the transcript there of the government lawyers, they express zero confidence that they're even going to be able to come up with a theory of this case. They say they're using words like might be possible.
Yeah, I mean, and when you read the transcript, what is clear is that we have a government by chaos, which is not new, although it seems that we take it to new heights day by day, and this is a new height. Essentially, what happened here is that the Department of Justice, the Department of Commerce, understood last week's Supreme Court decision as basically saying they have to go forward with the census without the citizenship question because, you know, those people live in reality and the census is supposed to start taking place, you know, months away. And we're talking about printing millions upon millions of documents. And so they live in that reality. And I don't know if Fox News or one of the president's donors or some crazy right-wing news site attacked that position. And then the president does what he often does, which is listen to the far right of his base versus his own government and put out a tweet. And there we have essentially the Department of Justice scrambling to keep up. But I think what happened here is the judge in the case recognized that this is a farce. I almost feel badly, but not quite, for these lawyers who are going to spend the next 36 hours scratching their head, manufacturing some possible rationale, and they are likely to get laughed out of court, which will just be an embarrassment for them, but hopefully will mean that our census is not ridden with racism and xenophobia.
Yeah, and Gene, this is a game the president plays. I mean, he's been defeated before, like on Mexico paying for the wall, and then he continues to tweet that Mexico will pay for the wall. This is an instance in which if you continue to tweet things that aren't true, there's a judge who can drag the government lawyers into court and say, okay, 2 p.m. Friday, tell me exactly what's going on here. And so the tweeting game ends at 2 p.m. Friday.
Yeah, it certainly does, and this is a whole new sphere. You can, you know, and Mexico will pay for the wall. Well, he can tweet whatever he wants, and there's no consequences. But there are immediate consequences here. These lawyers have to come in, and as you say, they can't just come in with some ridiculous theory that amounts to suborning perjury or something else that might get them in hot water. With legal associations, with bar associations. I mean, they have to take this seriously because, after all, this is a federal court, and you have to take things seriously in the federal court. Words have meaning, and they have consequences.
So the president is going to have a campaign rally at government expense tomorrow in Washington, where he will pretend to be trying to inspire the country. But of course, once again, he'll surely only be speaking to people who voted for him. Let's take a look at some polls that shape the frame that the president will be speaking in tomorrow. He'll be speaking to a country where, according to Gallup now, 45% of the country wants Donald Trump impeached and removed from office. In addition to that, we have a recent Pew poll that is very relevant to tomorrow, and it's how do you feel when the president speaks? What happens to you? What are your feelings when the president makes public statements? 76% are concerned, confused 70%, embarrassed 69%, exhausted 67%, angry 65%, insulted 62%, frightened 56%. And what the president's going for tomorrow, only 36% of Americans are ever proud of the president when he speaks, or feel pride when he speaks, and only 33% have ever felt inspired when Donald Trump speaks. And so, Neera, that's the audience he'll be speaking to tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think the issue here is whether he is speaking from a teleprompter in which he basically says a bunch of words we all know he doesn't mean, or he speaks from the heart and creates all the emotions on the first column. And what I felt reassured by is that I literally have all of those emotions in one day listening to Donald Trump. So I think the reality of this is that the president is going is, we are about a year and a half from this election, less than a year and a half from this election, and he is deeply unpopular. The important issues around impeachment is that those numbers are moving up. They were in the 30s. They're now at 45%. Perhaps after Robert Mueller testifies, it'll be into the 50s. And I think that's a new moment in the country where you have a majority asking for impeachment and removal. That will start putting some pressure on Republicans in races like in Cory Gardner's race and Susan Collins' race, where you'll actually see some of them finally feel at least some pressure around impeachment.
And, Gene, another set of polls that the president is facing today, Morning Consult poll, showing his disapproval in very important swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida. Much higher disapproval than approval. Michigan, 55% disapproval, 40% approval. This is a campaign event for him tomorrow, and those numbers don't look good.
No, they don't. I mean, remember last time in 2016, he had to thread the needle in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. You look at those numbers, there is no longer an eye in that needle. It's just closed. There's no way to get a piece of thread through there. So he would either have to change those numbers dramatically or come up with some other theory of how he gets to 270 electoral votes. I'm not quite sure how that would be. I'm fairly confident that what he's doing tomorrow is not a good start. I am biased. I live in the Washington area. We here feel a certain ownership and a lot of pride in our 4th of July celebration on the Mall, and to have it sort of usurped in this way by any president to give a political speech is really an outrage and something that some of us have strong feelings about. Maybe the president likes it that we have strong feelings, but we have strong feelings anyhow.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.